I'm going to cover about a 30-year period, which is a period beginning at the end of the Second World War, when Canada was had a very racist, inward-looking immigration policy, designed mainly to keep people out and ensure that we all stayed as white as possible. Through a period where that began to change, and then where it changed profoundly, and ending up with the Indo-Chinese refugee program, where a whole series of innovations, changes, policy initiatives, and whatnot came together to allow the country to harness the goodwill of its citizens and bring 60,000 people to Canada in about 18 months. Something that eventually resulted in our being the people of Canada, as opposed to the government of Canada, being awarded the Nansen Medal. I found this little quote in the annual report of the Immigration Department from 1941, a year and a half into the war. After the Great War, the term refugee applied mainly to those who had lost their homes and citizenship. Latterly, it applied to all who, because of political, religious, racial, and economic troubles, actual or threatened, have been forced or induced to move. I found that quite amazing, that a department that was spending its time making sure we didn't get any refugees in the lead up to and during the war, and in fact for some period thereafter, was paying so close attention at that stage that they actually not only were picking up a change in the nuances about what a refugee was, but thought it was so remarkable that they put it in the annual report. So, that worked in? No, it didn't. I think I would like somebody to show me which button exactly to push here.
The arrows.
Because obviously I've got the right one. I have an excuse for this.
Arrows?
Oh, that one. Okay.
Do you remember there's a delay? So it'll show up here.
Yeah, okay.
It'll show up here.
So hang on. So I push that.
It's there.
There it is. Okay. Now, war ends 1945. Happily, we won the war. The big problem for the government at that stage is we have 1 million servicemen and women overseas, so the business of thinking about refugees obviously isn't going to come onto the agenda very early in that period. The Immigration Department at that stage was located in the Ministry of Mines and Resources, actually quite a good place for it. And its job was basically to control and to ensure that Canada's demographics and color did not change. And when you read the papers from that time, racism was probably a word that they didn't know about, but it was something they practiced. Anti-Semitism deeply embedded in the policies and the administration. At the end of the war, Canada expected another recession, which is exactly what happened after the First World War. Instead, there was a boom. And one of the results of that was that despite the fact that 1 million men and women had returned, there was a really very serious labor shortage, especially in our resource industries, which were earning the money for the country, pulp and paper, things of that nature. It seemed to me like the guys who'd spent 5 years living in foxholes weren't interested in going out and working in the bush anymore. They'd rather stay home close to their wife and families. So what to do about it? In addition, because of 15 years of shutting down immigration, there were a lot of families, particularly who had relatives in Europe, war-torn Europe, anxious to bring them to Canada. And so that, plus pressure from a small number of very active, very skilled faith community leaders, put an enormous amount of pressure on the government starting in 1946, which was to result in a statement by Prime Minister Mackenzie King on 1st of May 1947. This is quite an infamous statement. The first line there, you don't have to worry about, talks about, we're going to open up immigration, ensure there's careful selection, and that it will address our needs. But the line that's remembered today is that the people of Canada do not wish, as a result of mass immigration, to make fundamental alterations in the character of our population. Large-scale immigration from the Orient would change the fundamental composition of the Canadian population. Now, it's interesting he made that statement, but what is also interesting is very few people actually objected to it, because that did reflect accurately what the kind of country Canada was at that time. What's often overlooked in Mackenzie King's statement, when you go down to it, is a sentence where he says, we have no legal obligation to bring refugees to this country, but we have a moral obligation, and we're going to do something about it. And that's exactly what they did. Oops, I think go back a step if I can. Yes, so he no sooner finished talking than the government dispatched something called the Canadian Government Immigration Mission to Europe. Within a month, the first boatload of refugees or displaced people from Europe arrived. They set up something called the Immigration Labor Council, and refugees were brought in under orders in council by occupation. Our operational partners at that time were the International Refugee Organization, which operated in occupied Germany and Austria, and something called the Canadian Christian Committee for Refugees that operated in other parts of Europe. In all, of the 1 million displaced refugees, or displaced people in Europe at that time, Canada admitted about 163,000. It was actually not so much a humanitarian operation, although it had a humanitarian, something of a good character. We needed workers, and the people in those camps needed someplace to live, preferably as far as possible from Germany and the Soviet Union. So it was and so quite often this gets ignored when people look at what was done on the refugee front. 1950, they decided we would have a new department and took the immigration department out of the mines department and matched it up with citizenship, a brand new function for us because, of course, until 1949 there was no such thing as Canadian citizenship, so we needed machinery for that. And they paired it up, oddly enough, with Indian Affairs, with the thought that, as Louis Saint Laurent said, to make Canadian citizens of those who were born here, of the original inhabitants of the territory, and those who immigrated to this country. 2 years later, they bring in the 1952 Immigration Act, an extremely restrictive act designed to protect the status quo in terms of the nature of our population. Full authority to, it's really interesting, if you read that act, you will find very little about letting people in, an enormous bit about keeping people out, no mention whatsoever of refugees, and when I look at it, I think my family would have had a hard time getting in because it prohibited the admissions of idiots and imbeciles, and we brought a lot of them to us when we came. So I was glad when they changed it. In the gap between the setting up of the department and the new act, Canada, and more specifically the Department of Foreign and External Affairs, deeply involved in setting up the founding elements of the regime, of the refugee regime. That include leadership in drafting the convention, creation of the High Commission for Refugees, and creation of the Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration. And just let me give a personal view here. The thought that you could consider the regime and not include ISIM, as it was then, IOM today, in it, strikes me as surpassingly strange because the Russians made sure and were very active in keeping the UNHCR away from the resettlement business, the movement of people. They thought the proper thing for Soviet refugees to do was to come back home and either be executed or sent to the Gulag. And there was some so ICM was created outside the UN structure, mainly so that we wouldn't have to have the Soviet Union on the governing board. That's why it was there. Now, in terms of negotiating the convention, I'm very grateful to James, who provided a lot of information to me that I didn't know. ECOSOC had a committee on refugees and stateless that was brought into existence. 13 member states from the NATO and Warsaw Pact side of the world were put on it, including Canada, along with Brazil, Venezuela, and Israel. And a Canadian by the name of Leslie Chance was elected chair. He did an amazing job. You can imagine the early days of the Cold War. Soviets lined up on one side, Americans on the other side, using refugees as a foreign policy tool. Everybody trying to do what they could to ensure the minimum state obligations towards refugees. And out comes the convention, which, as we know, in its original state, is very Eurocentric and restricted to events that happened before 1951. Nevertheless, largely because of highly skillful chairing on the part of Leslie Chance, the bill was drafted, revised, and adopted within an 18-month period. And of course, it becomes one of the great foundational documents of the refugee regime. Now, there we are. Whoops. Back one. Now, Canada refused to ratify. and to the absolute horror of the negotiators from the Department of External Affairs. And it wasn't just the Immigration Department, it was Cabinet was worried about anything that would impinge on our society, and they were worried that the refugees might provide a stream through which Soviet infiltrators might come to Canada. We'd learned that they were quite active here in the Guzenko affair in late 1951. So they were paranoid about anything that might in any way inhibit our ability to decide who comes and to decide who goes. And under that, beneath that, and you see it in what they had to say about the horrors of having someone from UNHCR actually come to Canada and look what was going on, was the notion of not wanting the racist nature of our immigration policy exposed to the light of day. On the other hand, while the Immigration Department continued to order the deportation of all sorts of people from Eastern Europe, Cabinet simply said no deportation to the Soviet bloc, so those orders had no effect. And the government argued with some reason that when refugees arrived and were given permanent residence status, they actually got a better deal than what was outlined in the convention. I mean, you come in as a permanent resident, you're on your way to citizenship, you have access to everything that citizens have. Great paper, by the way, on this by Laura Matacoro, that hasn't seen the light of day yet, on this whole business of why it was so difficult for the government to decide to accept this and the forces that were at play. Really, really worth reading. It's interesting, the External Affairs never lets go of this, and they keep returning to the charge every few years, and between the immigration and the Mounties, they managed to hold it off again and again. But it's over time, the excuses for doing it get a little thin. Now, one of the interesting things that people have forgotten is, nevertheless, we were in Europe selecting refugees and displaced people for all this time, and we had to have a definition. So I just showed that to you. This is actually, for the purpose, a better definition than the convention definition, because while it's Eurocentric, it gets away from the pre-1951 limitation of the convention, and was very, very good, easy to use and to administer. Right along. It's like living in a time warp here. It comes up here and comes up, and then it comes up there. So let's just talk a little bit about the Canada and the UNHCR and ISOM as I'm not going to go into it in any great depth. But one of the interesting normative issues that came up was, should the definition in the UNHCR's mandate be different or broader than the definition in the conventions? And interesting enough, Canada came down on the side of, yes, there should be a broader definition, because there was a notion that the UNHCR had to do things that beyond what convention signatories would do. And this is quite important in terms of what was said yesterday about the UNHCR's eventual ability to go out into the world. First, in the case of the Algerian refugees, this broad definition that they used did not restrict their activities to Europe, did not restrict their activities to pre-1951 events. So it was a useful thing that we contributed. In terms of the Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, as I mentioned earlier, this was about having a logistical organization to move migrants and immigrants to Canada and the rest of and America, the rest of the world. And since the Soviets were against that, it was set up outside. Canada's relations with ICEM were very, very shaky. And eventually, at some point in the 50s, we walked away from the organization. And I was involved in trying to get us back into it. And you should never quit these things, because boy, it takes a long time to get back in. And just a thing, in those days, Cold War days, young Foreign Service officers like me were given a very severe briefing on what you do if you're at your mission and somebody from the Soviet Empire comes up and strikes up a conversation. You have to go home, you have to write reports, you have to tell your superiors, you have to be on. And the instructions that young immigration officers had about contact from ISOM were almost as strict. So they were obviously a terrible threat to us in some ways. It was not very clear to those of us who were young at the time. So, 1953, the annual report of the Immigration Department says, we're not even going to bother to report refugees anymore because it's over, and big surprise, 1956-57, Hungarian Revolution. The government doesn't want to have anything to do with it, but the Canadian public romanticizes the freedom fight. Guys, with berets and things, and Molotov cocktails, and Soviet tanks. The government did this because, first of all, the Mounties say, we're going to get infiltrators from the KGB in here. And the Immigration Department said, essentially, we're not sure that Hungarians are quite white enough. And there's and members of the Hebrew race may sneak in. Old prejudice is very strong at that time. Happily, after Ontario said that it was going to go get the refugees as the federal government did, the government swung into action, and from that point, it was really amazing because a very efficient minister by the name of Jack Pickersgill got on a plane, went to Vienna, organized a totally disorganized bureaucracy there, and we ended up taking 37,000 refugees. He got half of them billeted in European countries over the winter. The first half came by ship, the second half came by airplane. Big change in the world, airplane. But historically, the importance of this was the precedent and pattern for much of what happened in subsequent years. Just as today, when we're talking about the Syrians, we refer to the Indo-Chinese. When we were setting up the Indo-Chinese, we kept referring back to Hungary as the precedent for what to do and why to do it. Just a quick point on World Refugee Year that was touched yesterday. Canada was in a deep recession following the arrival of the Hungarians, and we'd taken an enormous number of immigrants, both from Hungary and from the UK, where oh my goodness. Anyways, we took for that the focus was on TB patients, and we brought in about 1,000 people. Then things begin to change. The 60s come. Values change. Prosperity makes a lot of things possible. The sense of Canada's role as a middle power on the world stage. Europe is recovering from the war. Migration is drying up. Immigration remains very, very controversial. The government's very nervous about doing anything about it. But the Conservative Prime Minister John Biedenbeker's role in the Commonwealth vis-a-vis South Africa and his Bill of Rights make it very clear that the immigration policy of keeping people out on the basis of race simply won't stand. And as a result, Canada's first female immigration minister, Ellen Fairclough, brings in new regulations in 1962 that remove most, though not all, of the racial barriers. But they don't give the visa officers any kind of criteria. They just say if they got the education and the right skills, bring them in. Very difficult policy to explain and understand and manage. And the changes were brought in so quickly and quietly that most of the immigration people of the day felt that the politicians were not sincere, and they wanted the Immigration Department to keep up what it was doing. Oddly enough, the staff of the Immigration Department at that stage, replenished by vast numbers of university graduates, was ready to change. And there was no difficulty in switching from the race-based thing approach to another. Trial Balloon, 1966, a white paper on immigration, which I'm sure you've all read and memorized, says, among other things, that because of the peculiar problems that refugees have, we should probably be dealing with them differently, and we should sign the convention and protocol. And External Affairs at that stage returns to the charge. Immigration's rearguard action against it is crumbling. In addition, there's an operational change. 1967, the famous Canadian point system, first system for dealing with refugees, where the people in Boston and the people in Bangor are screened against the same system, comes into place, and immigration officers are scattered around the world. By 1969, immigration officers are interviewing people wanting to come to Canada in 100 countries. So the things are changing very, very rapidly. The institutional change, Department of Manpower and Immigration, is set up in '68 to make immigration more in line with our immigration need, with our labor partner needs. But in the objectives of that department, in the very DNA of that department, 1 year before we even signed the convention, is a line that says one of your objectives is to ensure that Canada discharges its international obligations for the assistance of refugees. Now, is this important? It's important because now a minister has this responsibility. Now a deputy minister has this responsibility. Now the immigration department clearly owns this. And so when you own something, then you begin to look after it. Right along, come on. Signing the convention we do in 1969, but it's really important to understand that the protocol to the convention comes in '67. So as Canada's immigration system is going universal, because of the protocol, the Refugee Convention goes universal. And it's a very happy coincidence. And so Canada ratifies the Convention Protocol in '69, and the same years we deal with another Soviet intervention, this time into Czechoslovakia, and we resettle 11,000 of those refugees. The largest group of refugees who arrived with tennis rackets that we ever saw. Because they'd all gone, all sorts of people were out, they were allowed to go out, so they all went to the end and all took their tennis rackets, and they all showed up at our office. You could buy a Skoda car at that stage for $10. Absorption of the convention. Fundamental document of Canadian policy, and I think Canadian refugee policy really begins on the 27th of July 1970, which should be a national holiday, because the Cabinet looks at the implications of signing the convention, and you see this comes directly from the CAB document. We got a problem. Our immigration policy is universal since 1967, but the refugee program is still stuck in Europe. We now have to send it out into the world. So this is a major step. And they bring out of this cabinet discussion, and it's one that we should pay attention to, a number of key decisions. Refugees will be admitted without geographical limitation. We will use the convention definition. We will use the point system, but with this generous application of discretionary authority because of the extra help refugees get here. And we will create a new category called the oppressed minority policy, which allows us to deal with people oppressed within their own countries as if they were refugees. The immediate impact of this operationally is that the posture of the Immigration Department on the refugee question and relations with UNHCR goes from defensive to innovative. And they even at this stage, in the instructions that go to the field in the famous Ops Memo 17, which I'm sure you've all read, provides an enormous amount of guidance to officers about what to do now that we're convention signatories, even abroad, even though the convention says nothing about resettlement. And it announces that we're going to set up a committee just in case somebody shows up on Canadian territory and claims asylum. We'll set up a little committee to do it. The signing convention meant we should build it, and having built it, guess what? They came. Refugees beyond Europe, all of a sudden, this is tested right away. 72 Uganda Asians, oppressed minority category becomes very, very useful because the Ugandans, when we find them, are being expelled, but they haven't been expelled. So not convention refugees. UNHCR is not involved in any way in this one. We take 5,000 from there and pick up 2,000 in subsequent years. Next year, the Chilean movement, extremely important, if only because of the anger that the Canadian government's initial handling of this generated in the Canadian church and human rights community, and which gave birth, as far as I can tell, to the current institutions that come together in churches and other forms to advocate on behalf of refugees. We bring out 7,000 refugees despite the criticism, and this really is interesting because we're dealing Argentinian refugees and Chilean refugees at the same time. The Chileans in Argentina are convention refugees. The Chileans in Chile are coming out as oppressed minorities, vice versa with the Argentinians, and we're also taking people directly from prisons, bring them to Canada, and they start arriving at our doorstep to provide work for the new Refugee Determination Committee. Indochina, first wave. what kicks that off, interestingly enough, is the arrival in Montreal in April 1975, just as Saigon is going down, of about 500 Vietnamese students from Montreal, who we didn't even know were there. And their arrival, unannounced on the lawn of Parliament, scared the living daylights out of the government, and is the impetus for us to get involved. First, by agreeing we'll pick up relatives where we can find them, and so we do. And we bring in 9,000 at that stage. She's told me I have 50 minutes to go. Now, we come to the point of revamping, finally it's enough. The immigration law is out of date, and we go. And I'm just going to, what I'm going to say about this just quickly is that the law, for the first time, involves a huge amount of refugee material, and at the same time, the actual founder of our refugee policy, a long deceased man by the name of W.K. Bell, begins to build the institutions with the creation of a refugee policy division in the immigration department, whose job, among other things, is to figure out how to apply the new provisions of the law, design the sponsorship system, design the designated classes, and take the lead in our relations with UNHCR. Going right along, we'll talk about the handbook. That's a great story. We'll save that for later. That was our first defeat at the hands of UNHCR. So we have a whole series of refugee things, but the critical things are the sponsorship program and the ability to create what are called designated classes, where if the convention isn't quite right, we can write our own decision and then put the rest of the refugee stuff on the calendar. This became extremely important in the succeeding years, where, like today with the Syrians, the convention is not the right tool to figure out who we should be dealing with. So we'll move on. Now, I'm going to follow this one through, okay? So, 1978, turning point. Cambodia irritates, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia irritate the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese decide to do something about it. Invasion, eventually as a consequence of that, 800,000 Cambodians either on or over the border with Thailand started. Same time, ethnic cleansing of Chinese, in particular middle-class people in Vietnam begins, and the boat people thing really gets going. We set up early in the year something called the SBE, Small Boat Escapee Program, 50 families a month, huge. Mr. Hartling, the new High Commissioner for Refugees, comes to Canada. UNHCR policy up to that stage is, yes, take the Vietnamese, leave the Cambodians and Laotians, eventually to be able to go home. I take Mr. Hartling to lunch and he says, why don't you guys take some Laotians in Cambodia? And you talk about influence. Almost a casual noon-hour remark. Out of that comes, within 3 weeks, the minister says, yep, we're going to go and set up what we call the TOR, the Thailand Overseas Refugee Program. We redesigned the small boat escapee designated class to an Indochina designated class, and we realized, well, we'll do this, we're going to have to open another visa office, this time in Thailand. In this process, a very small irritation led to huge results. To fund the boat people, we had money in the kitty in the immigration department, but we needed new money, $250,000 for the overland refugees, 20 families a month, peanuts. 6 weeks of my life were spent in a futile battle with those hard-headed SOBs at the Treasury Board to get $250,000. I was so furious at the time that I sat down and I wrote a paper that said, look, we've got to do two things. We've got to have a better network of consultations with our friends in External Affairs and SIGA, so that we can not only deal with those guys out there, but deal with those guys in here collectively. And since the Immigration Act requires an annual immigration plan, why don't we slide a refugee plan as well? So once a year, we get our money for the refugees, rather than spending our every 6 weeks going after we had 4 or 5 programs going. And so I was spending all my time with the Treasury Board, which is not, and if you know people from the Treasury Board, I don't know where they come from. And I don't know why
Should we turn the mic off for a second?
I don't know why the 52 Immigration Act didn't screen them out. I just don't understand. Anyways, institutions are important. Out of that comes a 4-point refugee alliance. External Affairs UN Division, Immigration Refugee Policy Division, and the brand new division over at CEDA called MHA invented. And between the three of us, with the new addition of a first full-time immigration officer in Geneva to act as the point, we developed a very powerful little alliance, not only for managing our internally, but actually influencing UNHCR. And this sort of remains to this day with changes. But that comes out of my irritation at not being able to get money. So it's a very shows how sometimes small things happen. First annual now, the results of this. In December 1978, the government looks at its first annual refugee plan, and they agreed that from now on, when we do immigration levels, we will do refugees as well. That opens up a whole thing of consultations within Canada, but also, for legitimacy and utility's sake, consultations with UNHCR. The first plan comes out, and it's heavily influenced by two things. The refugees from a boat called the Hai Hong, which Canada had intervened on behalf of, have arrived 2 weeks before. There's been a first consultation in Geneva with UNHCR, and among the cabinet documents is the High Commissioner's report that's on the table. So as a result, more than half of the actual commitment is given over to Indo-Chinese refugees. But the second thing, and if we just keep reading, the second thing is a second document goes in there, and it sets out a refugee resettlement strategy and a whole series of things that put the UNHCR and what we today would call the regime at the center of our planning and thinking. There's a strategy which is pure Kurt Bell about, if we're going to do it, there'll always be more than we can take, so let's take the ones who we can fit in but who are in the greatest need. Wonderfully, perfectly square circle. Move on, come on. Yalla.
It's up there.
Set up evaluation criteria for looking at refugee questions. And these are really interesting, because the situation is what they're saying, we will intervene if the government has looked at it, the UNHCR and the world community agree that there's a high need, there's a high level of need, and that resettlement in countries like Canada is an appropriate solution. The situation is one where we have some reasons for doing so based on politics or geography. The situation is of such seriousness that there's a public consensus in the country that we should intervene. Vietnamese, now with the Syrians. And also a situation is of serious concern to a segment of the Canadian community who feel we should. And that applies to both communities and also things like the Refugee Advocacy Act. This is really an interesting thing. And this becomes policy that shapes what we do for probably the next decade. The centrality of the UNHCR in all this, where they said, who we're going to, in UNHCR, we're going to talk to. There's the ex-con, we talk to them there. The UNHCR people in the field close to the refugees, we talk to them, and we talk to the rep in Canada. So it sets out, this is where we really become attached to the UNHCR, because it's not only a matter of cabinet decisions, but the whole refugee thing then, because of the levels plan, gets hooked into the Canadian budgetary cycle. It moves to the center of the stage in terms of what we're doing. I think I'm getting pretty close to the end here.
I hope so.
Now, this all takes place in December. By April, the sponsorship agreements are rolling in. The Mennonites lead, but by the end of the year, we've got 40 sponsorship agreements. With sponsorship agreements, we have to create new institutions like a center to match refugees with sponsors. The Clark government comes in and says we'll take 8,000 refugees and 4,000 privately sponsored. In July 16, in a document that is talks very bluntly about the need for Canada to show leadership in the international community, the government agrees to take 50,000 refugees. The next day we tell the Canadian public, that's that 8,000 we've already said, and if you sponsor 21,000, we'll bring in 21,000. And this gets announced in Geneva on the 20th of July, and that was a big shock to us, the numbers. The bigger shock was when McDonald, the foreign minister, came back from Geneva on the 21st of July and said, we didn't mean start next month. We mean start now. So, 6 days later, an airlift begins, and in the next month, the entire immigration system was redesigned and revamped to manage the admission of 60,000 people. So I don't know how this connects totally with the regime, but boy, this bringing 50,000 people in and the participation of our citizenry was something UNHCR had never seen before. And I think in the Arab world that we would say that from that we acquired a great deal of trust, which we continue to exercise to this day. Thank you very much.